To talk with you about a very important story that has a lot of ethical implications. So I'm glad to be with Dr. Eric Betts to talk about the Henrietta Lacks story. So tell us a little bit about the story and maybe some of the ethical issues that come up from this story.
Yes, Henrietta Lacks was born in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, which is in Southern Virginia, which is in my hometown, in my region, I should say.
Right.
And but the Henrietta Lacks family comes from a plantation town called Clover, Virginia.
Right.
And my family is related to the Lacks family, and we all came from that same plantation, that same sharecropping time together. And so that's what drew me to the story of Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, you have a connection.
Yes, yes. And although she was born in Roanoke, Virginia, she moved to Clover, Virginia in her early childhood years. And she moved in with her cousins there in Clover, Virginia, and they worked from sun up to sundown in the tobacco fields. And I grew up around those tobacco fields, so I know what that kind of looks like. But Henrietta Lacks had married in the 1940s, and this was the time of Pearl Harbor, where another great migration took place because of all the shipbuilding and the steel and so forth, and Baltimore was the place to go at that time.
Right.
So Henrietta Lacks and her husband David Lacks, they moved to Baltimore at a place called Turner Station in 1941, and it was there that she had 5 children. And back in those days, having children was a welcome thing.
Yeah, right.
And sometimes women were afraid to go to the doctor because the doctor might do something to them, a procedure or something that would hinder them from having children. So many times they were willing to go through pain in order to have children. That was the value that they had a family in those days. Now it was during that last year, 1951, the last year of her life, that she found out that she had cervical cancer. The beautiful thing about Baltimore is that they had a hospital called Johns Hopkins.
Yes.
And Johns Hopkins was committed to helping poor people and blacks to be able to get medical treatment where they otherwise would not have received medical treatment. Now the problem with there's some downsides to Johns Hopkins too.
Right.
And that is Johns Hopkins was notorious for experimentation. And they felt that because we're offering this service, that the subjects owe us the ability to do research on them without their permission. That's the debt that they have to pay to us.
Right.
And so this was the attitude of Johns Hopkins. Matter of fact, Johns Hopkins did a study on the inclination of blacks to criminality. They did a research. They drew blood, and this was funded. This was funded, and so there was an organization, I think it was called the ACLU. I'm quite sure that's what it was. Right. Stepped in and said, "You guys got to cut this out. This is not a good thing."
Right.
And so they cut it out, and they said, "Okay, we'll allow you to get. We only do it if we get consent."
Right.
And so those are some of the things. And people were very nervous about Johns Hopkins in the community because there's the rumor that because of the research, children shouldn't go around Johns Hopkins because they might get snatched up and. Some of it was rumor, but there's always a little bit of truth to some of these things. And so that's what was going on during that time. So it was in 1951 that she started feeling pain. She felt a knot inside of her. In spite of that, she had a child. that same year. She didn't want to go in because she thought that she was going to have a hysterectomy.
Mhm.
That's also a big part of the story as well. Hysterectomies,
Right.
because you're familiar with the Tuskegee study,
Right.
syphilis.
Yes, we studied that in class.
Yes,
Yeah.
the injections
Yes.
and then how they watched them die.
Yeah.
But there was also what is called the Mississippi appendectomies,
Mm.
where they would study how to perform appendectomies on black women
Right.
and to stop them from reproducing and to be able to do research on them. So a lot of women were very afraid if they had any problems going on in their bodies, and this brings us to what happened with Henrietta Lacks, because doctors were trying to figure out how to know when there's simply a cervical infection and when there's cervical cancer.
Right.
The problem was sometimes people only had infections and they was being diagnosed with cervical cancer,
Right.
and they were giving these women appendectomies
Mm.
when all they need was antibiotics.
Right.
And then on other occasions, they were diagnosing them with having infections when they actually had cervical cancer.
Right.
And the problem was they didn't know how to, even if they knew they had cervical cancer, they didn't know how to treat it.
Right.
So they said, we need some kind of sampling, some kind of specimen
Right.
to know how to deal with cervical cancer. We also want the scientific community want to know how we can keep cells
Right.
immortalized. How can we
Right.
create a culture to keep them immortalized? In enters Henrietta Lacks, in the midst of all of this here.
Right.
So, Dr. George Guy of Johns Hopkins, Richard Tillin was also a researcher who was trying to minimize unnecessary appendectomies.
Right.
So they get together. Henrietta Lacks is going through pain. She's suffering from cancer,
Right.
and it's metastasizing very fast. So she has to sign a paper consent form to get the surgery.
Mm.
Now what happens is she doesn't know that they are already making plans to do research on her.
Right.
So what happens now is Henrietta is wheeled in. Whoever the assistants were, the researchers, during the surgery, they're also doing research.
Right.
So they go in, they cut out a part of her cervix, the cancerous portion, and also a healthy part of her cervix, and they put it in their dish. They take it to their lab, and they notice after a couple of days that these cells are reproducing at an astronomical rate.
Right.
That one researcher said it was mythological proportions.
Wow.
A generation of cells was being created every 24 hours.
Mm.
Today, Henrietta cells, if you were to stack them 350 feet high, they could go around the Earth 3 times.
Wow.
There's trillions more cells that existed today than were ever in her body, and she was only 5 feet tall.
My goodness.
So these cells, there was nothing ever like this before.
Right.
And that's why she's called an unsung hero of medicine. That she's the most important thing that happened in medicine in the past 100 years.
Right.
So they take the sample, they put it in the dish, and it begins to reproduce. They went back in again at another occasion, and it took this her portion of her cervix as well. In neither case did they get consent.
Right.
But here's an interesting thing. When she dies in 1951 in October, they asked the husband for consent to be able to do an autopsy on her, because they want to go back in and cut some more to do more research. Now, this is the strange thing about medicine, is that you don't have to get consent when a person is alive.
Right.
But when they're dead, you have to get consent.
Oh.
And so one of the things that Henrietta Lacks' parents said when Henrietta Lacks said, to one of her friends, don't allow anything bad to happen to my
Right.
children
Right.
when I die. A lot of bad things happened to them after she died. Molestation took place. Child abuse took place. They were virtually starved almost to death. And the reason why I bring that out is because in the name of research, sometimes we forget the human stories.
That's right. That's right.
Sometimes science becomes the highest value, and we forget and we lose the sense of humanity,
That's right.
the sense of sympathy and concern.
Right.
This is not just a specimen, it's not just a subject.
Right.
These are human beings,
Yes.
and that they should be cared for as well. So
Yes.
they grow up, one of the children commits murder because he could not control his emotions because of all the abuse.
Right.
The judge doesn't give him the maximum sentence because
Right.
she felt compassion for him because of
Right.
his experience. Even in his late adult years, he had problems.
Right.
The daughter, who's the center of the story, the immortalized Henrietta Lacks, she suffered from schizophrenia. She suffered from paranoia. She suffered from diabetes, high blood pressure. None of them had medical insurance. Sonny, who was one of her children, had to have heart surgery. He wakes up to a $125,000 bill. He has no medical insurance. He goes through his entire life with the burden of this debt. So some people ask the question, why couldn't the scientific community do anything about the family
Right.
of this
It seems
woman?
after the fact it
Right.
would have been the right thing.
Yes. And so it's called the HeLa, H-E-L-A, cells, and they helped out specifically with the polio vaccine. Because in 1951, that's when the great polio epidemic
Exactly.
broke out.
My brother-in-law had polio as a child.
Oh, okay, yes. That's the HeLa cell line is where they get the vaccine to
Okay.
help with the polio. And FDR was instrumental in this as well. Now what happens is, in 1951, Henrietta Lacks' cells began, the same year of her death, her cells could make a contribution to society in this way. The polio vaccine, Tuskegee, going back to
Right.
Tuskegee.
Right. Right.
I don't know if you've seen the images of the famous Black History images of the Tuskegee
Yes. Yes.
nurses and researchers looking through the microscopes.
Right.
They created the first mass lab for the reproduction and the mass production line of the HeLa cells. There's 35 black doctors and scientists that were involved in this. And so they were shipping millions upon millions. They helped hundreds of thousands of people
Right.
with the polio vaccine. Now what happens is, National Institutes of Health steps in. They cannot keep up with the demand because of the polio epidemic.
Right.
So there's a company, there were two men who started a company called Microbiological Institute. And this becomes a